There is a war within American culture about whether people should or should be permitted to eat meat. For simplicity's sake, and because a famous meat alternative comes in the form of a burger, this paper will call this war the Burger War. The Burger War on its surface appears to have two sides, pro-meat and anti-meat. The anti-meat side can be symbolized by Impossible Foods, the young and rapidly growing company that produces Impossible Burgers, which quote-unquote bleed like meat, despite being made from plants and yeast. The phenomenon of Impossible Foods helps us understand the burger war in the historical and cultural context of a modern trend of food politics that we will call governing by nature. A recent media stir caused many who enjoy eating meat to worry. A popular online article in the dailymail.co.uk claimed that upcoming US legislation would reduce red meat consumption by 90% by implementing taxes on meat to account for meat's apparent calculated carbon emissions. Almost immediately, a chorus of publications took the anti-meat side, arguing that the Daily Mail's claims were sensationalistic extrapolations of the proposed law and are therefore debunked. It's true that there is no direct policy proposal within Biden's Green New Deal climate change policy to directly limit meat consumption. However, in one of these quote-unquote debunking articles, the author writes, Biden is not after our burgers, but ditching them every now and then is a responsible thing to do. It's good for the body, it's good for the planet. So those who advocate for the end of meat production and consumption say that there is no policy war on meat, while implying that there should be. Meanwhile, those who want to produce or eat meat feel threatened. Now, neither side in this argument seems to realize that the burger war is being waged not at the level of state policy or federal policy, but rather in subtler but nonetheless consequential ways. The conflict today is mainly taking place in the realm of the private sector of for-profit companies and among NGOs. Still, the burger war is political. Before going further, I should state that my paper doesn't aim to endorse either side of the burger war as it currently stands. It does critique Impossible Foods and the political process that it embodies, and does defend meat production on a non-industrial scale, on cultural and ecological grounds. As for industrial meat, one could equally apply much of our critique of Impossible Foods to industrial meat systems as well, but that would be a different paper. So Impossible Foods is at its heart a fake blood company. The company owns the patent for the production of a chemical called leg hemoglobin, or leguminous hemoglobin, because it is essentially the same as the chemical hemoglobin, which is found in red blood cells. Leg hemoglobin comes from the roots of the leguminous plant soybeans. But the soy plants don't produce enough leg hemoglobin for it to be efficiently grown. And so Impossible Foods has developed a technology, of gene editing technology, to splice a soybean gene that codes for the production of leg hemoglobin into a yeast organism, which causes the yeast to then produce leg hemoglobin in a sterile laboratory environment. Impossible's assumption is that leg hemoglobin creates a simulation of meat with its savory juiciness, which offers a complete and effective replacement of animal meat. Impossible CEO Pat Brown goes so far as to say, quote unquote, when people crave meat, they are actually craving hemoglobin. And the implication is that if they eat leg hemoglobin, their meat craving will thereby be satisfied. Now, Impossible Foods is also defined by their very aggressive rhetoric. They clearly seek to plant its flag. The company clearly seeks to plant its flag and conquer the market for meat on a global scale. Here's an example of that aggressive rhetoric. On May 3rd, 2021, Impossible Foods' official Twitter account posted, "Move over, cows. No room for you on a sustainable planet. Our goal is to replace animals as a food technology. Beef is the first step." Note that this is a technocratic message. It assumes that animals are a technology and are not efficient enough. And it is a totalitarian message. There is no room for cows, according to Impossible Foods, on this planet at all. So how are we to make sense of such a ambitious program and phenomenon like Impossible Foods? What does this teach us about food politics? So in my thesis, I've surveyed 3 influential theories of power, each of which relates directly to food systems. I then synthesized elements of these theories into a single framework, which I call governing by nature. My argument is that food systems represent the most significant interface between humanity and the rest of the natural world, and therefore government of food systems is both the most significant aspect of government of nature, and is also among the most representative and universal areas of government in general. We can't understand the nature of government as a whole without understanding the nature of government of food systems and by food systems. So the first theoretical model that contributes to governing by nature is that of enclosure, which we can define as the imposition of control over access to spaces, and, in addition, control over the productive capacities of those enclosed spaces. The most commonly referenced enclosure is that of the common farmlands of England. For centuries, land was held in communal local management systems, wherein yeoman farmers each had access to one or several long strips of farmland. Then, through various historical processes, some financial and some violent, the land was enclosed into a system of private property. Oftentimes a physical barrier was erected, turning the land into an enclosure to which access was severely limited. Local communities, thus enclosed out of the land with which they had previously generated their livelihoods, were forced to find other means of subsistence. Many of them moved to cities in search of work, thus entering into a new enclosure, the labor market. The labor market, it's important to note, is not exactly a place, as is a woodland or a grain field. The labor market is in many ways a concept that is determined by other concepts. The factors that determine its nature are units of information, such as wages, skill assessments, and prices. Despite its non-physical nature, though, the labor market is just as real of an enclosure as is a fence around ancestral farmland. The fence deracinates the yeomen and leaves them no place to go but the labor market. But the reality of enclosure is not quite as simple as the above paragraphs would suggest. There has been much scholarly debate about the true nature of the process and the outcomes of enclosure. The image here in this slide is shown from the poster of a movie called Winstanley, which is an interesting film, about a popular leader of 17th century enclosure riots, wherein rural populations dug up hedges and ripped down fences in resistance to the enclosure movement. Karl Marx wrote at length about the English enclosure in Das Kapital, and was, as you could probably guess, uniformly derisive towards England's capitalist enclosures. Others have argued that perhaps the effects of enclosure were positive, perhaps it promoted agricultural efficiency. Encyclopedia Britannica, in fact, blithely claims that the enclosure the part of the enclosure movement that took place between 1750 and 1860 was done for the sake of agricultural efficiency. And it basically refers to enclosure as unmitigated progress. But the boldest endorsement of enclosure comes from a famous essay by Grant Hardin, published in 1968, The Tragedy of the Commons. Alongside an argument for coercive population control, Hardin describes, quote-unquote, the horror of the commons, wherein a rabble of self-interested commoners do the quote-unquote rational thing and overgraze the pastures that they all share. But Hardin's argument is disproven by history. Surely such a disaster has occurred somewhere at some time, but it certainly didn't happen in the English Midlands during the pre-enclosure era. During those centuries that immediately preceded enclosure, farm yields actually rose by about 80% over medieval levels. It seems that the yeoman farmers of England were not purely quote-unquote rational capitalistic automatons. They gathered together, as humans have tended to do, and made rules to govern grazing and cultivating arrangements. A detailed analysis by Robert C. Allen, a economic historian, showed that enclosure actually only increased yields by 5 to 10%, depending on the area, and only then the increases were significant in areas with heavy, wet soil that landlords could drain. And you have to think, is a highly leveraged and capitalized landlord the only means by which heavy soil could be drained, or could, with enough political will, those lands have been drained and the enclosure, or the commons, left as commons rather than being enclosed? Now, so overall, a sober analysis shows that the English enclosure was essentially, in the words of legal scholar James Boyle, rapacious state-aided privatization. This aspect of enclosure was brilliantly excoriated in an anonymous poem first cited in the 1820s, which begins, "The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose, who steals the common from off the goose." So much for the English land enclosure, which has echoed around the world from Germany to America to Ethiopia, with variations on the same theme. The concept of enclosure also extends beyond physical lands to realms of information and intellectual property. James Boyle has written that we are now in the middle of a second enclosure movement of the intangible commons of the mind. Boyle discusses the extension of property rights to genes, including the human genome, and to ideas, such as buying a product by clicking a mouse. For the rest of this section on enclosure, we will describe Mark Andreevich's writings on the quote-unquote digital enclosure as a contemporary extrapolation of enclosure that is directly relevant to impossible foods. In his paper, Surveillance in the Digital Enclosure, Andreevich writes of the emergence of the Internet, which was initially a state-sponsored project. The Internet represents a profoundly consequential example of innovation taking place without the prospect of a lucrative personal financial reward. But then the Internet was enclosed. Andreevich describes how the once distributed and diverse network of the Internet now flows through the portal of a handful of enormous private companies. Some of this enclosure exists under the euphemism of quote-unquote the cloud, a service for remote data storage that is often quote-unquote free. Andreevich argues that such services should be considered enclosures. He offers the example of Google Docs, which offers document editing and storage without a direct monetary charge, but then mines the contents of documents for data that is then packaged and sold to marketers. Just as English landlords generated new capital streams by capitalizing land that had previously existed outside of the financial system, so now are internet companies capitalizing modes of human communication that were previously untracked, unaccounted, and often non-commercialized. Andreevich references the work of Massimo De Angelis, who writes that the process of enclosure is continuous in modern societies and is totalitarian in that it seeks to eventually enclose everything in the world. Now, these enclosure processes generally lead to an asymmetric control of resources, such as farms being amalgamated under fewer and fewer owners, and in the case of the internet, large companies leveraging capital to utilize more and more processing power and data storage more cheaply. The more we use services such as Google for convenience and because it seems cheaper, the more we give up our access to the means of internet production by empowering these monopolies. We therefore enter into the enclosure that is Google and must adapt our behavior according to the rules of this privately owned and determined system. This is how the digital enclosure, like the land enclosure, has barred access to means of production on land and online. Enclosure is thus a form of coercion that doesn't always need physical threats. It can be achieved by tantalizing promises of freedom and prosperity, or, as we will see in the case of impossible foods, a delicious replacement of a desired food experience, as well as certain purported moral benefits. Now, the second theoretical model that is part of the governing by nature framework is called by the strange name of governmentality. Now, this word, which was coined by Michel Foucault in the 1977 through 78 lectures called Security, Territory, and Population, is a word that he actually apologized for when he coined it, because it's, in his words, lacunary, diffuse, and obscure. He's essentially describing a network of power institutions that is more than the government, more than what we call the government, which when we say government, we are referring to what Foucault would call the state, which is, we can think of, in America, it's the federal state, is what we typically call the government. So governmentality is the art and science of governing a population. Now, other entities that make up this government, it's called Foucault calls it an assemblage of governing organizations, include large institutions such as corporations and nonprofit organizations. Now, unlike pre-modern states, monarchies, etc., who use discipline and direct measures to rule, governmentality governs a population, and mainly works to indirectly influence the spectrum of possible choices for the population. In other words, they conduct a population's conduct. A modern word for this, described by, I believe, Cass Sunstein, is called choice architecture, wherein the choices available to people are presented rather than coercive laws being imposed. So it's helpful to mention the meanings that Foucault offers for the word to govern, because it didn't used to mean what we currently think of it meaning, and its historical meanings of the word actually reveal a lot about the concept that we're discussing here, and which will be relevant to Impossible Foods. So in a physical sense, historically, to govern is to direct or put on a path, and also to support by providing means of subsistence. On a moral level, govern refers to the conduct of souls. It also refers to the conduct of individual bodies. A prescribing doctor governs the health of the patient. One may govern oneself, and if one behaves badly, one exercises bad self-government. So in summary, the term to govern refers to the control one may exercise over oneself and others, over someone's body, soul, and behavior. Foucault uses the phenomenon of food scarcity to help reveal the notion of governmentality. Every wise wielder of power knows that hungry people revolt. So for centuries, states would strictly regulate the price and production of grain, trying to prevent any form of food scarcity. Unfortunately, these direct control mechanisms often failed when a state introduced glut would lower the price of grain enough to prevent peasants from being able to afford seed for the following year, causing scarcity. The deficiencies of this system were recognized by early economists who studied economics as though it were physics, as a natural rather than moral phenomenon. These economists advocated for the freedom of commerce and for the circulation of grain as the fundamental principle of economic government. These economists also attempted to look further back in the chain of physical and economic causes to see the factors that cause fluctuations in the price of grain. Then they attempted to influence those prior causes. To exert this influence, the government favored small tweaks, such as subsidizing or taxing imports or exports. They also studied how people acted, quote-unquote, economically rationally in a laissez-faire system. They saw that when left alone, the apparent problem of food scarcity was often solved by food scarcity. When prices of grain were low, people would hold their grain, and that would cause the price to rise. And when it rose up to a level where people would profit, they would sell their grain, which would keep grain on the market and keep prices from spiking. Unfortunately, there's always a lag time between prices before prices adjust to new levels of supply. This means that some people will be unable to afford bread for a long enough time that some may die. These infrequent deaths were tolerated in modern governmental governments. At this point, Foucault defines a crucial term, the population. Now, the population is to be considered in contrast to a multiplicity of individuals. In the context of food scarcity, a requirement of ruling a state was to make sure that the whole multiplicity of individuals had access to grain. On the other hand, a strategy of governing is to ensure that through the manipulation of natural processes of trade circulation, the population as a whole has enough access to grain to remain a population that is governable. The individuals in themselves that constitute the multiplicity of the population, they don't matter in terms of governmentality. They don't matter except insofar as they are a part of the population, which is considered as an aggregate of data. So the population consists of individuals who behave according to the economic rationality assumed by these modern economists, holding grain when prices are low and selling when prices are high. The causes and nature of the population's behavior are understood to be relatively simple. The population as a whole, Foucault writes, has only one mainspring of action, and this is desire. The desires typically recognized by modern governments are the desire for material wealth. Perhaps that's the most universal and reliable urge, the desire to feed one's family. And in addition to that, the desire for increased social status or moral status. And in the modern world, especially a status of high virtue. So, of course, some people are motivated by other desires, but these desires are not often understandable to the government or adjustable by the government. And they therefore render a person who has those desires not a part of the population. So as we noted, before the modern era, the verb to govern referred not to political processes, but rather to personal interactions. Foucault discusses a type of power honed by the Christian church in Christian societies called pastoral power. A pastor is a shepherd, and Christ as the good shepherd took responsibility for the soul of every single sheep in the flock, rather than the flock as a whole. And the pastoral power executed by Christ's priestly earthly representatives was a government of individual souls insofar as those souls were a part of the church. Now, a pastor was expected to both risk the entire flock for the sake of saving one sheep and to sacrifice the pastor's own self for the sake of the flock. Now, insofar as people are part of the population, modern governmentality governs them via their desires, and thus aims to supplant the church as a personal pastoral guide, rather a pastoral guide of the population as a whole rather than any particular persons. We noted above how governments accepted some death as part of their laissez-faire approach to food scarcity. Modern governments govern the population as a whole, and in order to maintain that population, some members of the population might be required to be sacrificed for the sake of the government to retain its power and for the circulation of goods to continue. Now, this ethos is in fact the exact opposite of that of the Christian pastorate, which was expected to sacrifice itself for the sake of any member of the flock. Now, governmentality is not just a tool of the state. In fact, its power processes essentially outsource certain state powers to other institutions with which it is linked by a shared ethos. The philosopher Shane Pepper describes a modern example of governmentality at work in the HIV/AIDS documentaries produced by HBO, a private media company. HBO, taking on a governmental role to manage what was considered a global epidemic, produced dozens of documentaries over the course of decades, often featuring U.S. state officials, and at the same time valorizing quote-unquote free market solutions rather than state interventions to address the problem of AIDS. Now, these different institutions in the assemblage aren't necessarily collaborating directly or coordinating or conspiring. Instead, they are joined together by a certain type of rationality. In the case of AIDS, and in other cases such as climate change, every member of the governmental assemblage will take a similar modern approach. They all seek to generate a data set by which management decisions can be made, and then rationally implement those decisions. Let's say that the government, through its distributed analytical institutions, has determined the maximum tolerable number of AIDS cases that a society can tolerate. The government then focuses its rational capabilities and technologies on keeping the number of cases below this threshold while expending the minimum amount of money and instituting the least limitation of economic freedom possible. Now, these rationalities operate most powerfully on human subjectivity by seeking to structure the field of possible actions. Now, a last note on governmentality before we move on. Throughout the history of the emergence of governmentality, there has always been a countercurrent, which Foucault calls counterconduct. People who practice counterconduct seek to be governed by a different set of institutions, or perhaps unrealistically, to not be governed by centralized institutions at all. Foucault notes that these revolts are often co-opted and eventually controlled by governing institutions. So the third theory, the third theoretical model that influences the governing by nature framework, I call high modern efficiency. Now I want to introduce this theory and this concept with a question, which is, how can a squirrel tell you when to plant corn? Before I answer, I'll introduce the man pictured, the philosopher James Scott, he's more of a political scientist than a philosopher, who is also a small-scale farmer, raising sheep and, as you can see, chickens. He is the one who accurately describes, but clearly does not practice, high modern efficiency. Now, James Scott points out that there are many ways to think about the optimal date to plant corn. One way is to list a calendar date. May 22nd, that could be a good day to plant corn. That could be the best average day to plant corn, as determined by a university professor in Iowa after lengthy perusal of historical records. But during any given year, that day could also be a mediocre day to plant corn. This particular year could have a late frost or a cold spring, which could push the optimal date back. The calendrical date has in itself no bearing on local geography, weather, or ecosystems. Therefore, May 22nd has limited use as an agricultural principle. A related way to indicate a particular planting date is to describe the moon's cycle. On the day of the second full moon after equinox could be a good day to plant corn. This type of notation is often used by farmers' almanac publications sold in department stores. It is a bit more connected to the physical world than is a calendrical date, but not by much. After all, the moon cycle is the same in Iowa as it is in California. And in the latter state, you could probably plant corn much earlier than you could in Iowa. And then there is a third way to tell somebody when to plant corn. This way contains no quantitative information, no information about the moon, and no numbers at all. It relies upon close observation and comparisons of local nature. Now, Squanto, a native of what is now known as Massachusetts, told early New England settlers to plant corn when the oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear. Now, this probably bewildered the settlers at first. They were growing a new crop on an unfamiliar continent. Perhaps they had already begun to rely on calendar days and moon cycles in their agriculture where they came from. So they probably had less of a keen eye for observing these signs, these cyclical signs in nature. And we can understand that ourselves. I mean, I certainly don't know how big my local squirrel's ears are, and I would have trouble comparing those ears to an oak leaf emerging in late spring. So as difficult as it can be, especially for us modern people to imagine, there are distinct advantages that come from looking for qualitative, analogical information in local ecosystems. The oak trees are superbly adapted to the region and must possess some way to respond to the gradual changes in day length, temperature, air pressure, and humidity that characterize their place. Their growth rhythms, if you know how to observe them, act like weather forecasts. Of course, it's not always perfect. different oaks in different particular spots. Might be in a different microclimate that influences different growth rates. But as a principle, it's one that's generally good to follow to avoid frost. Now, think of this qualitative, grounded, and ancient way of planning when to plant corn. And then think about the exact opposite process, and that is high modernism. Scott defines high modernism like this: a supreme self-confidence about continued linear progress, the development of scientific and technical knowledge, the expansion of production, the rational design of social order, the growing satisfaction of human needs, and not least an increasing control over nature, commensurate with understanding of natural laws. A particularly sweeping vision of how the benefits of progress must be applied through extensive prescriptions for a new society. So, naturally, high modernism values efficiency. It almost worships it, in fact. But what type of efficiency does high modernism value, and at what cost is such efficiency achieved? One necessary ingredient for high modern efficiency is legibility. Usually we think about legibility in terms of handwriting. It is legible if it can be read by a stranger who knows your language. The same concept can apply to aspects of nature and culture. Can they be read by outsiders? Can a wheat farm in Siberia be understood by a bureaucrat in Moscow? A piece of land owned by a single private farmer is much more legible than a commons, where dozens of locals may have a share and a say, and no two seasons are ever the same. Legibility was thus achieved by means of enclosure into private property. But legibility can also be achieved by force, as during the collectivization of Soviet farms in the 1920s, during which millions of acres were administered from Moscow offices. Similarly, but with less starvation, American farms have grown massively larger, worked by fewer and fewer farmers and more machines during the past century. And leverage has made them ever more legible to financial institutions that profit from those farms. Now, tropical plantations are another example of legibility building, and an example that highlights what types of efficiency are highlighted and preferred by high modernism. Now, James Scott claims that for almost any plantation crop, and almost any crop in general that one can name, smallholders have historically been able to outcompete larger units of production. Time and time again, small producers, owing to their low fixed cost and flexible use of family labor, could consistently undersell state-managed or private sector plantations. So the efficiencies gained by creating legible, high modernist farms are not matters of crop yield or price. High modernism values a different type of efficiency. A large consolidated farm or plantation is efficient insofar as it is a unit of taxation, of labor discipline and surveillance, and of political control. It's more efficient for a state to tax, or an investment company to appropriate, the profit margin of one 500-acre plantation than 10 50-acre plots. This type of efficiency is what is meant by high modern efficiency. It's an administrative and appropriative efficiencies. As people are shunted off of locally managed lands into centrally governed, governed in the broad Foucauldian sense, plantations, then cities, factories, or suburbs, or plantations, cities, factories, or suburbs, these people are forced to become, in some ways, standard generic citizens, members of the population, predictable and malleable. High modernists, Scott claims, have always been planning for quote-unquote generic citizens who need so many square feet of housing space, so many acres of farmland, liters of clean water, and units of transportation, and so much food, fresh air, and recreational space. These citizens have, for the purposes of the planning exercise, no gender, no tastes, no history, no values, no opinions or original ideas, no traditions, and no distinctive personalities to contribute to the high modern enterprise. And as such, they are members of the population. High modernist programs, no matter the ideology, be they capitalist, communist, or something in between, universally seek to dislocate regionally rooted people and enclose them into a legible system, into a governable population. So, these are the three theoretical models that combine to form the framework that I call governing by nature. Here is a summary of the framework's thesis, how it works. A process of enclosure gradually encloses various aspects of food systems, from farmland to food preparation, into legible systems that, due to their legibility, grant increasing degrees of oversight, appropriation, and indirect control to an assemblage of governing institutions, all guided by high modernist efficiency. Within these enclosures, people lose their authority and ability to govern their natural environments and become part of the legible population, governable according to their own reduced and idealized desires. The information and technology generated by this process enables further enclosure, more standardization, and more capitalization of ever more sectors of culture and nature, transforming more people into generic, quantitative units. So, at first glance, the methods of modern farm and food politics appear diverse. After all, the enclosure movements in England, colonial plantations, Soviet collectivization, and American industrialization of farming and food each took place in very different cultures and bioregions with different ideological justifications. But underneath this patchwork surface, each of these phenomena shares a common structure. This repetitive underlying structure, hidden by the contingent facts of each individual situation, is governing by nature. Now, before launching at impossible foods, let's look at a few more examples. One is GMO seeds. GMOs represent a new enclosure, a genetic enclosure. A 2013 Los Angeles Times article told the story of a farmer being sued by agrochemical giant Monsanto, now part of Bayer Inc., because he grew some soybeans that carried Monsanto patented genes without a license. The article notes that, quote unquote, in the 200 plus years since the founding of this country, and for millenniums before that, seeds have been part of the public domain, available for farmers to exchange, save, modify through plant breeding and replanting. Through this process, farmers developed a diverse array of plants that could thrive in various geographies, soils, climates, and ecosystems. But today, this history of seeds is seemingly forgotten in light of a patent system that, since the mid-1980s, has allowed corporations to own products of life. Now, the ascendance of GMO soybeans has dramatically increased Monsanto buyers' profits, while increasing the farmers' cost of planting soy fields by 325%. Because a handful of large publicly traded corporations have been able to enclose the seed market and have completely stopped selling non-GMO seeds. And thus, quote-unquote free market high-tech enclosures sponsored by highly leveraged corporations may enclose food systems just as much as vicious state-sponsored crackdowns. All of these enclosures have been justified by promises of increased abundance, prosperity, and above all, efficiency. Usually, this actually means high modern efficiencies of administration and appropriation. A similar process has occurred with meat processing. So currently, the production system of meat, the animal husbandry system of meat, is very diffuse. Protein production at its sort of fundamental level happens often on family-run operations, which are widely scattered throughout rural areas. But meat processing and slaughter is extremely consolidated. Most of that process is owned by, I'd say 85% of all American beef is slaughtered by just 4 companies. And James Mitchell, an economics professor at University of Arkansas, argues that this is good for the meat industry because it has boosted, you guessed it, efficiency. The boosted efficiency is, of course, high modern. It is efficiently profitable for the meatpacking corporations and efficiently legible for the government assemblage, of which the livestock economics professor is a part. In other ways, one could argue that there are more, this is actually grossly inefficient. While profits of meat packers have increased during the past 10 years, the consumer price of beef has risen by up to 12% annually. Meanwhile, farmers and ranchers' share of meat prices has decreased to just 37%. Revenues this low are squeezing ranchers out of business. Such iniquitous arrangements are rightly derided by anti-meat advocates such as Impossible Foods. though perhaps they are also celebrating the bad times for ranching businesses. But as we'll see, this iniquity is just as likely in a system defined by impossible meat as it is by real animal meat. So let's see, move on here. So as food is governed by nature, farms are reduced to factories. Traditional knowledge is replaced by quantitative specialists and software algorithms, and profit and power is enclosed and granted disproportionately to members of the governmental assemblage. And perhaps this process of governing by nature is at the heart of our contemporary burger wars. Those who are ridiculed for being unreasonably paranoid about the state taking away our burgers are in some sense correct to worry, although it's not the state, it's the government. And their instincts and objections point toward a real threat. The government, in its broad Foucauldian sense, continues to appropriate more and more of farm and food culture and economy. This is a political, economic, and cultural threat, not just to those who produce and consume meat, but to all those who derive a livelihood, a culture, and an identity through direct interaction with nature. Okay, now let's look at impossible foods. So, Impossible began in 2011 after a Stanford biochemistry professor named Pat Brown took a sabbatical and pondered how to make the biggest positive impact on humanity and the planet. He decided to focus on the most destructive technology on Earth, livestock. That's his quote, the most destructive technology on Earth. By eliminating the inefficient and dangerous quote-unquote technology of cattle, chickens, pigs, etc., Brown and Impossible believe that they will achieve their mission, which is to save meat and Earth. More specifically, Impossible aims to, quote-unquote, drastically reduce humanity's destructive impact on the global environment by completely replacing the use of animals as a food production technology. Now let's zoom in on the molecules of Impossible's product. As I noted before, Impossible owns the patent for its production system of leg hemoglobin, fake blood. According to Impossible's high modern scientist, this fake blood makes its mix of soy protein and coconut fiber into beef. Literal, according to them, meat. Now, unlike animal beef, this imitation meat is hyperlegible. Every single burger patty will contain almost exactly the same cocktail of known, isolated, and recombined genetically modified chemicals. In this respect, Impossible extends an enclosure that already existed, that of GMO seeds, from farm fields and soy fields into food processing facilities, wherein genetic modifications offer private ownership of life forms and their associated information. This enclosure creates a deep chasm between food producers and food consumers. With most foods, the barriers to entry for production have to do with access to land, capital, and skill. If you really wanted to, you could probably produce some food like chicken eggs, for example. But here, in the case of Impossible Foods, the barriers to entry involve not only enormous amounts of capital and engineering processes, but also legal barriers. Even if you were to learn exactly how to assemble the elements of Impossible's production plant, and had the capital to do so, you legally could not produce and sell an Impossible burger. Now, we learned from Foucault that the main spring of control of governance of a population is via desire. Now, with its earth-friendly message and potential for vast monopoly due to its intellectual property, Impossible Foods has attracted many prominent investors. So far, they've raised $1.3 billion, and they plan to go public in 2022 at a valuation of $10 billion. And some of the people who have invested are well known. They include Bill Gates, UBS, and Google Ventures. Other investors are pop culture icons, pop culture idols, such as professional athletes and musicians like Jay-Z and Katy Perry, who dressed up as an Impossible burger at a Met Gala in New York, as pictured down at the bottom right. Above, we quoted Impossible founder Pat Brown's statement that people's craving for meat is really just a craving for hemoglobin. According to Brown, our tradition of eating meat is not only reducible to a desire for pleasure, it is even reducible to the desire for the pleasurable experience of eating one particular chemical. This desire, Brown implies, is so powerful that it alone motivates people to resist the government's exhortations to stop eating meat. Now, Impossible's role is to leverage this desire for hemoglobin in order to govern society away from our sprawling system of meat production and consumption toward a world free of all livestock. So, by manipulating the population's desires, Impossible is conducting people's conduct and exercising a form of pastoral power. By eating Impossible burgers, we are assured we will benefit our own health and quality of life, and we will contribute to the overall project of mutual salvation from the tribulation of climate change. Now, Impossible Foods exemplifies the high modernist viewpoint that underpins governing by nature. This high modernist viewpoint is the ethos that ties together the assemblage of governing institutions. It is what they have in common and why they are able to all sort of drive towards the same goals without even conspiring or collaborating. And the Impossible Foods just represents it as almost a paradigmatic example. So for Impossible, every single problem is technological. Animal husbandry is framed as a food technology and maligned for its inefficiency, an inefficiency that is calculated quantitatively based on legible data. Now, governing by nature rationality that defines Impossible Foods looks at a cow and sees numbers, and then decides that the cow must be taken off the pasture because some numbers are too high and others are too low. Governing by nature rationality doesn't contemplate the living soil under the cow's hooves, or the cow's historical relation to the people. The cow is beef, and the beef is protein, and the protein is money. The cow is carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is worsening weather. People are data points in the statistical field of the population. Impossible's constant invocation of its sustainability as a selling point for consumers and investors causes some people I know, especially humane livestock farmers, to accuse Impossible of greenwashing. People say that all they care about is their profit, and they're just using climate change as sort of a shibboleth to increase their sales. But the governing by nature framework doesn't need us to have such a cynical view of Impossible in that particular way. For us, looking at Impossible, we see a different problem. They may very well be sincere in their care about climate change, especially when we look at Dr. Pat Brown. He may be completely sincere. Others, some investors perhaps, may be more profit-oriented, but we needn't assume that they are they're acting in bad faith. The real problem here is that Impossible sees climate change and ecological issues and agricultural issues in general through a narrow, high modern lens. And this lens exclusively accepts approved and legible metrics, such as the assumptions about methane production used by the UN panel on climate change. Now, they also wield the hammer of technology, especially genetic modification technology that makes everything into a nail. So Impossible blames meat, and cows in particular, for climate change. This is a common charge articulated by members of the governmental assemblage from the UN down. And this accusation against beef is undergirded by the assumptions that all beef production exists on the wasteful and cruel continuum of industrial feedlot production, and that food systems necessarily cause negative impacts on the ecosystems that support food production. Humanity itself is seen as divided from nature and as an expensive consumer of resources on the earth, and we should strive to reduce the expenses of our own consumption. We are completely separate, and all of our exchanges with nature are zero sum. Now, perhaps these assumptions are true for most beef production, but certainly not all. To be more accurate, the argument should constrain itself to refer to beef cattle raised in the particular way of modern industrial production. Beyond a doubt, most feedlot beef is inefficient and causes environmental harm. But there are other methods of producing beef that has a very different, often beneficial impact on the landscape. And they manifest a different idea about how humanity can relate to nature while producing food. We can produce food as a part of nature, in collaboration with living nature. Pictured on the screen is a scene from Alder Spring Ranch, a beef operation in Idaho, where humans on horses intensively manage cattle grazing on upland pastures, keeping the animals out of streams, resting certain fields as needed, and protecting them from wolves. It's a nature-connected operation, and it produces beef that has been appraised as the very best in the world. The mountainous grazing has also produced benefits in biodiversity and soil health, and taught many young people about the techniques of observing and managing living nature. Impossible's assumptions about cattle and climate change are unable to account for various methods of beef production. So we should maintain some skepticism about generalized claims from the likes of the UN and Impossible. This is not to say that the scientific approach is useless for agriculture. On the contrary, James Scott suggests that a scientific approach is not only possible and useful, but is actually constantly utilized by good farmers, who themselves become careful students of natural vegetation and soil structure, exceptionally alert to micro features of terrain and environment that are important to cultivation. In other words, those who work on a particular piece of land, having long-term skin in the game of production and ecosystem health, often know better than do academics and bureaucrats who generate models based on generalizations and assumptions that reality often defies. Therefore, even though Impossible's concern about climate change and sustainability may well be sincere, it is at best an oversimplification of the issue, and its genetically modified solution is predetermined by a set of unnecessary and self-serving assumptions about food production. These assumptions may be the best information that a centralized high modern scientific view of the world can offer on such a large scale. Such a view can only interpret quantitative data from legible sources. And often the relevant data for an operation such as Alder Spring Ranch is not only qualitative, it's not only unique, but it's also qualitative and not reducible to quantitative data always, and so it's therefore not legible to government institutions such as Impossible Foods. So ultimately, it actually doesn't matter all that much for Impossible's growth prospects or for the goals of governing by nature with which Impossible Foods aligns, whether they will actually reduce carbon emissions. Similarly, the Soviet collectivization effort of the 1920s and 30s failed to achieve its stated goals of efficiently providing lots of food, but was nevertheless a political and governing by nature success because of its latent effects. In destroying Russian agrarian traditions and livestock, the collectivization concentrated power that had previously been distributed across the countryside into the hands of Soviet central planners and experimenters. Similarly, if Impossible is to grow and replace a large section of the meat industry, or as they state their goal is to completely replace animal agriculture, even if it had no impact on carbon emissions, it would still be a governing by nature success because it would have eradicated distributed livestock husbandry and consolidated production power for itself and for the food governing assemblage as a whole, of which Impossible is a constituent element. So we can look at the efficiencies, the relative efficiencies of Impossible Foods and of Alder Spring. Now, Impossible Foods has the high modern efficiencies. It is hyper-legible, obviously, and is therefore easier administratively to tax and to analyze. And it's also easier to appropriate the profits. There are way more people investing in Impossible Foods than in Alder Spring Ranch, for instance, or organizations that follow the model of an Alder Spring Ranch. But what if we take some different views, some different types of efficiency that we might value more than high modern efficiency? What if we are to assume, as unenclosed agrarian and indigenous cultures have for eons, that food is not just a experience of eating a particular chemical or a matrix of nutrients, but is rather a source of physical and cultural nourishment, and that healthy food must grow in healthy ecosystems. What if we recognize that management of healthy ecosystems can't be necessarily taught online or even in a classroom, but must rather be developed through practices such as riding long hours on horseback, watching cattle ruminate high mountain grass? What if we acknowledge that the meaning and importance of food cannot be reduced to its assortment of chemicals or the immediate sensory experience of eating it? When we start with these latter assumptions that prioritize health, nourishment, and meaning, Alder Spring begins to appear incredibly productive, vital, and yes, efficient. In 3 months of grazing each summer, so many things are accomplished at Alder Spring. Restoration and nutrient cycling in fragile but vibrant ecosystems, frequent monitoring of beaver habitat developments, the development of skills among people young and old, hundreds of cattle living naturally in a beautiful setting, the production of food of incredible culinary and nutritional quality, an inflow of monetary income to a rural area, and the composition of sharing of stories on Alder Springs blog that show us how deeply food can connect us to the rest of the natural world around us. That's a lot of things accomplished all at once. Cultural, ecological, and economic efficiencies. So we have seen in this paper, or this presentation, that the burger war is not as simple as it has been framed to be in the media discourse. The dispute isn't about whether we must collectively sacrifice pleasurable desires for the sake of sustainable ecology. After all, Impossible Foods promises to completely satiate the desire for meat with its replacement plant-based meat products. Nobody, Impossible Foods insists, needs to make a sacrifice of pleasure. We just need to adopt Impossible's food technologies into our diets. And yet the conflict goes on. Now, I want to make a brief note about the two sides in this conflict. They can be characterized perhaps on partisan lines. You might say that the anti-meat side is more liberal, more democratic, and more pro-state. And you might say that the anti-meat side is more anti-state. They are could be described as paranoid or afraid of an overbearing, tyrannical state or government, and more libertarian when it comes to the rights of corporations to act without state infringement. But the point that I'm trying to make here about the burger war is that dichotomy doesn't exactly address the reality of the situation. What we see is not a state versus a corporation. What we see is a state and corporations acting in concert, not necessarily in a conspiracy, as we said, but in a concert as an assemblage, meaning that they have the same goals and they share mutual benefits. So what benefits one member of the assemblage, what benefits the state, also benefits another member of the assemblage, such as a corporation like Impossible Foods. And so this sort of left-wing, right-wing dynamic of state versus corporation and who to blame and who to be afraid of and is not a very deep way or accurate way to analyze the situation. What we have instead is a government of institutions that seeks to centralize and consolidate its power over food systems and to enclose our food systems and enclose us out of food production systems. Us meaning people who are not directly invested in large-scale food operations such as Impossible Foods, you might say, and those who want to produce our own food, those who want to have small-scale animal production. So the two sides of the burger war are more, it's more about who gets to govern nature. Is our government of nature itself governed by the assemblage and the enclosure, or are we able to interact with nature in a way that is connected and in an older sense of the word, organic? So the conflict goes on. And obviously the burger war has higher stakes and a more subtle and deep nature than the mainstream media would like to say. So if they succeed, then Impossible Foods and its controlling owners would attain a sort of pastoral power. Whereas Christian pastors labored to help people gain salvation, Impossible Foods would offer the population protein, deliciousness, absolution of environmental sins, and salvation from apocalyptic climate change. Impossible Foods could define the possible options of behavior available to the population. If you want to get protein, you have to act this way. They would no doubt guide us and the population towards making efficient choices, high modern efficient choices. In return for this cooperation, members of the population would be able to enjoy Impossible's proprietary plant-based and genetically engineered yeast-based cheese, milk, eggs, and fish product in addition to the company's burgers. There is no limit to the protein desires that Impossible will be able to fulfill, and no limit to the sectors that Impossible will seek to enclose. Now, exploring the metaphor of pastoral government raises a troubling thought. In Christendom, the people were symbolized by sheep, and the priests and Christ were symbolized by the shepherd, the pastor. Pastor is a Latin word for shepherd. No sheep was allowed to be left out for the wolves. Each and every sheep must be cared for and protected, even at the cost of the pastor's life. In early modern government, as described by Foucault, the government assumed the pastoral role and took a laissez-faire approach, which allowed some members of the population to be sacrificed for the sake of the system and for the sake of the free circulation of goods and the continuing power of the governmental assemblage. Now, the symbolic relationship between humans and livestock is reciprocal. We can be symbolized as sheep, but also the way that a society treats livestock indicates something about how the government considers its population. As governing by nature has proceeded and the governmental assemblage has enclosed more sectors of the food, economy, and culture, we've seen the rise of livestock production factories that treat animals like machines, sacrificing animal welfare and ecological health for the sake of high modern efficiencies. At the same time, I have seen the city government in my hometown of Seattle approve aggressively ugly, high modern, efficient, and uniformly sterile housing developments all over the city. These housing units aren't nearly as tight as an industrial chicken battery cage, but they do indicate an abstract, instrumental, and dehumanized view of the population on the part of those who approve and build such structures. Now, bringing this symbolic power linkage of people and livestock into the context of Impossible Foods, we naturally wonder, what does it mean about our society's government when the explicit goal of one of its growing institutions is to totally eliminate livestock from food systems? Impossible Foods wants to, quote-unquote, save meat, presumably from animals and all of their inefficiencies, by making the term meat refer to something new. The company also wants to, quote-unquote, save Earth. From what? Perhaps our study of governing by nature and of ancient symbolism implies from humanity and all of our inefficiencies. So what are we to do in the face of governing by nature encroachment? Maybe we need a few thousand more iterations of Alder Spring Ranch. It's outside the scope of this paper to estimate how much cheaper and more abundant Alder Spring style food could become if the government were to support it. Could there be several Alder Springs in each watershed? Could this type of meat become much more mainstream? One potentially encouraging development is the growing market for carbon offsets, wherein storage of soil carbon through good grazing practices can be monetarily rewarded on marketplaces. However, this development also prompts apprehension because it could represent another angle of governing by nature. A carbon market would require frequent measurement of soil carbon levels, and this required data would constantly flow into the market in order to be monetized. It is therefore an enclosure of information, and could be extremely expensive to implement such constant carbon monitoring, although it could be lucrative in the long term. But such expensive and long-term lucrative investments often favor So just like agricultural machinery, these types of investments often favor centralized, large-scale, highly capitalized organizations. And small family operations such as Alderspring could actually be squeezed out and marginalized by the emergence of carbon markets. So carbon markets and some other forms of food activism, such as perhaps organic, and we could go into this in another video, are also enclosures in a way. And they are therefore kind of an example of Foucault's counterconduct that is co-opted and changed and changed by the governing assemblage in order to actually continue to benefit the governing assemblage. And ultimately, we can't expect the organizations that have centralized money and power to work on a meaningful scale against their own money and power and against governing by nature's progress. We can't expect governmental institutions to advocate for policies that would necessarily reduce and distribute their power and profit. So the ultimate consequence, so what do we do? Now, the ultimate consequence of governing by nature would be the deletion of all knowledge about food production and farming from our cultures. Therefore, one essential way to thwart this eventual deletion and to resist governing by nature on a small scale that is nevertheless important is to develop and spread such knowledge. You can personally and as a community cultivate your awareness of what grows in your region. Plant a seed in a pot on your windowsill. Talk to a farmer. Study your valley's agrarian history. Go look a cow in the eye. It may seem as though technology is bound to eat all the culture that connects humanity and nature. So let's grow more of such culture. Know your food. It isn't easy or fast, and farm success is never guaranteed, but growing food systems that are vitally and locally interconnected with diverse living nature is possible. So thank you for watching. That is my presentation about governing by nature. Like I said, there will be a link in the description if you would like to download the full paper with much more information, citations, and a much more thoroughly argued points than what I was able to describe in a bit over an hour here. And as I said at the beginning, please feel free to ask me any questions or send me any information that you think is relevant to this idea and this presentation. I would love to see it. I would love to continue thinking about this stuff and discussing this stuff with curious and engaged people. All right. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.